The moment you prioritize being liked, your authority begins to erode. Not publicly, not all at once. It happens in micro-adjustments, the softened opinion, the delayed disagreement, the preemptive apology. You tell yourself it is social intelligence. What it signals instead is that your position depends on permission. If you have ever edited a thought before speaking, not for clarity, but for approval, you have felt the mechanism. There are rules beneath likability that determine who is respected and who is managed. The more you need acceptance, the more predictable you become. And predictability is easy to steer. This is not about cruelty or indifference. It is about leverage. When others sense you fear disapproval, they do not need to threaten you. Your anticipation does the work for them. There is a strange kind of prison with no walls, no guards, no locked doors. You enter it willingly. You maintain it. You defend it. And most days you forget it exists. The most controlled people in modern society are not the ones being threatened or watched. They are the ones trying to be liked. Notice how often you hesitate before speaking, not because you lack a thought, but because you are already calculating the reaction. Will this sound rude? Will this cost me standing? Will someone misunderstand me? Will I lose something invisible but essential? Belonging, safety, approval. So you edit yourself. You soften edges. You trade truth for acceptability. Not a lie exactly, just a version that passes inspection. This happens everywhere. In workplaces where meetings are full of agreement but nothing changes. In friendships where honesty is exchanged for harmony. In digital spaces where identity becomes performance and approval is measured in numbers. That quietly train behavior. Even silence becomes tactical. Say nothing wrong and you can't be rejected. Approval starts to feel like oxygen. You don't notice it until you imagine losing it. Disagreement begins to feel dangerous. Not because the stakes are high, but because the cost feels existential. To be disliked no longer feels uncomfortable. It feels like exile, like falling out of the invisible web that holds everything together. So people comply long before they are asked. They anticipate expectations. They internalize rules. They become easy to manage not through force but through fear of disapproval. The system is elegant. It doesn't need violence. It doesn't need a dictator. It only needs you to care deeply about how you are perceived. Notice how quickly people apologize now. Not for harm, but for misalignment, for tone, for phrasing, for asking the wrong question. The apology is preemptive, a signal. I'm safe. I'm not a threat. Slowly, approval becomes currency. It determines who is heard and who is ignored, who is promoted and who is sidelined, who is amplified and who quietly disappears. It shapes opinions before they fully form. It rewards predictability and punishes friction. This is why censorship often doesn't need enforcement. People do it themselves. They learn what costs approval and avoid it instinctively. Over time, even private thought bends. Ask the uncomfortable question. How many of your choices are truly yours, and how many are designed to keep you acceptable? The clothes you wear, the opinions you share publicly but not privately, the moments you sensed something was wrong but stayed quiet, because alignment felt safer than truth. This isn't a personal flaw. It's a survival adaptation. For most of human history, rejection meant death. Isolation was not emotional. It was literal. Your nervous system still remembers that. Disapproval still registers as danger, but survival instincts can be hijacked. When approval becomes scarce, it becomes leverage. When belonging feels conditional, it becomes control. And when being liked is confused with being safe, people trade autonomy for acceptance without noticing the cost. The cage doesn't slam shut. It closes slowly, politely, one compromise at a time. And the most effective part is this. You're told it's kindness. You're told it's morality. You're told that wanting approval means you care. But caring can be used against you. The moment you see the cage, it's unsettling, because you realize you've lived inside it for a long time. And stepping out doesn't require rebellion or noise. It requires something quieter and harder. The willingness to be disliked, not recklessly, not cruelly, but consciously. That is where power actually begins. Long before laws, money, or ideology, there was the group. A small circle around firelight. Shared food, shared danger, shared survival. To be inside the group meant protection. To be outside it meant exposure, cold, hunger, predators, death. There was no self-sufficiency. If the group turned away from you, you didn't suffer emotionally. You died physically. That is the context your nervous system was built for. Today, approval is treated like a social preference, something shallow, optional, but biologically, approval is a signal of safety. Acceptance tells the brain you are protected. Rejection tells it the opposite. This is why being disliked doesn't just hurt emotionally. It hurts viscerally. Modern neuroscience shows that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Your brain does not clearly distinguish between a broken bone and being pushed out of the tribe. To your nervous system, exclusion is injury. So when your body reacts before your thoughts do, when your stomach tightens after criticism or your chest sinks after disapproval, that isn't weakness. It's ancient machinery doing exactly what it was designed to do. That machinery shaped how humans learned to live together. Groups rewarded conformity because sameness reduced risk. Predictability meant trust. Shared beliefs meant cohesion. Anyone who deviated introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. So deviation was punished, often not violently but socially. Ridicule, shame, ostracism. These weren't moral judgments. They were survival tools. Over time, humans learned how to read the room. What earned approval, what lost it. How to adjust themselves to the group's emotional temperature. This is where status hierarchies formed. Not around truth, but around alignment. High-status individuals were often the most attuned to group norms, the best at reinforcing shared beliefs, the least likely to destabilize cohesion. Truth mattered less than belonging. Morality followed the group, not the other way around. Evolution hasn't updated that software. Your nervous system still reacts to rejection as if you're standing alone, cut off from shelter. It doesn't understand modern abstractions. It only understands signals. Approval means safety. Disapproval means danger. But here's the fracture. In the modern world, rejection rarely means death. You can be disliked and still survive. You can be excluded and remain physically safe. Your biology hasn't caught up, and power structures understand this. If you control belonging, you control behavior. If you decide who is praised and who is shamed, you don't need force. People will enforce it themselves. This is why dissent is framed as betrayal. Why moral language signals allegiance more than truth. Why being aligned feels virtuous and disagreement feels threatening. Belonging calms the nervous system. Alignment feels right because relief feels right. So people confuse comfort with correctness. They defend ideas not because they've examined them, but because abandoning them risks isolation. What once kept us alive now keeps us compliant. The instinct to belong is neutral. It can create community or conformity, cooperation or control. Everything depends on who shapes the rules of approval. That's the dangerous realization. If approval is a biological lever, then those who control approval don't need to threaten survival. They simply offer belonging, and the body obeys. There is a quiet misconception woven into modern culture. That influence comes from being admired. That authority is earned through consensus. That if enough people approve of you, power will eventually follow. History shows the opposite. Power does not come from being liked. It comes from being independent of liking. The people who change systems are rarely welcomed. They disrupt comfort. They threaten incentives. They expose contradictions others would rather ignore. The group responds predictably, first with mockery, then dismissal, then moral condemnation. Approval, if it arrives at all, comes later, after the outcome is no longer negotiable. This pattern repeats so reliably it almost feels mechanical. Ideas that later become obvious were once considered offensive. People later called visionaries were once labeled dangerous or unstable. Not because they were wrong, but because they were early. Power operates upstream from validation. This is where confusion sets in. Popularity is mistaken for influence, admiration for authority. But popularity is reactive. It follows the crowd. Power is generative. It moves first and absorbs the consequences later. Seeking approval changes behavior in subtle ways. You begin monitoring consensus, softening language, delaying thoughts, asking, often unconsciously, is this acceptable? Is this safe? That question alone is a leash. At first, the compromises feel reasonable. A word replaced, a thought withheld, a silence where friction belonged. Be pragmatic, be likable, pick your battles. But compromises accumulate. Eventually, you don't just edit what you say, you edit what you think. You internalize the audience and call it wisdom. Nothing original survives that process. This is why power and likability rarely coexist. Power requires tolerance for tension, the ability to withstand misunderstanding without rushing to correct it, the capacity to act without immediate reassurance. Most people find that unbearable. They want feedback, affirmation, proof they're doing the right thing. So they wait. They align, they stay downstream, and nothing moves. Another illusion needs to fall, that goodness is measured by applause. Applause is not a moral metric. It reflects how well you match expectations, not whether those expectations are right. Groups reward familiarity. They elevate voices that stabilize the narrative. That makes approval a poor compass for truth and a terrible guide for change. Separating morality from approval removes a shortcut. You no longer get to outsource judgment to the crowd. You have to decide what you stand for without knowing if it will be rewarded. That uncertainty is the price of independence. Power grows there, not loud or theatrical, but structural, the kind that shifts norms instead of reacting to them. Resistance is often mistaken for failure. But resistance is usually the first sign that something real is happening. If no one is uncomfortable, nothing fundamental is being challenged. Here is the clean line. If you want approval, you must remain legible to the group. If you want power, you must sometimes be illegible. This is not a call to antagonize. It is a call to stop bargaining with perception. Power does not ask permission. It does not wait for consensus. It acts, absorbs backlash, and lets outcomes speak later. And the realization most people avoid is simple. Every time you trade truth for acceptance, you make yourself easier to predict, easier to guide, easier to contain. The more you seek approval, the more you flatten yourself. Sharp edges disappear, dangerous questions fade. What remains is agreeable, safe, and replaceable. Nothing original survives. Real power is not charming. It is not desperate to be understood. It is willing to be disliked long enough to matter. Control rarely announces itself. When people imagine oppression, they picture force, orders, punishment, someone visibly imposing their will. But the most stable systems of control don't rely on fear in its raw form. They rely on comfort. They reward obedience by making it feel pleasant. In modern systems, likability functions as a behavioral leash. Not through threat, but through incentives. Those who align are praised. They're described as reasonable, professional, emotionally intelligent. Those who resist are rarely debated. They are reframed. Difficult, negative, toxic, unsafe. Disagreement is quickly psychologized. Not addressed, but diagnosed. The content of the challenge becomes irrelevant. What matters is how it makes others feel. Once someone is labeled unpleasant, their ideas no longer need engagement. This isn't accidental. It's efficient. Reputational fear has replaced physical coercion. Instead of prisons, there are social penalties. Instead of chains, there are narratives attached to your name. You're free to speak, but not without consequence. And the consequences target the nervous system where it's most sensitive: belonging. Modern systems understand a simple truth. People tolerate material hardship more easily than social exile. Being tired, underpaid, overworked is survivable. Being seen as a problem is not, so behavior is shaped quietly. In workplaces, those who challenge assumptions are told to work on their tone. Their critique becomes a communication issue. The message is clear without being stated. Align or be isolated. In public discourse, ideas aren't defeated. They're buried under moral language. To question is to be suspect. To hesitate is to signal disloyalty. The group doesn't need to censor you. It only needs to make you anxious about how your hesitation will be read. Online, this accelerates. Feedback is instant. Approval is quantified. Disapproval is visible. The nervous system learns faster than reflection ever could. People adjust in real time. They learn which opinions bring warmth and which bring distance, which questions invite engagement and which cause silence. Over time, expression becomes optimized for safety, This is how internal censorship forms. No one tells you what not to say. You feel it. The pause before speaking, the tightening in the chest, the quiet calculation. Is this worth it? Eventually, you stop generating certain thoughts at all. This is the most efficient form of control because it's predictive. People don't wait to be punished. They anticipate it and adjust in advance. The system no longer needs to act. It only needs to exist. Likability becomes the interface. The more agreeable you are, the smoother your path. Doors open, friction disappears. Not because you're right, but because you're easy. And ease is rewarded. Those who create friction, even when correct, aren't silenced outright. They're deprioritized, overlooked, quietly excluded from where decisions happen. This is how power maintains itself without looking like power. What makes it so effective is that it feels voluntary. No one forces compliance. People choose it. They call it professionalism, civility, being a good person. But the choice is shaped. When approval determines access, visibility and stability, opting out feels reckless. So people comply while telling themselves they agree. The line between belief and behavior blurs. This is why control through likability is hard to resist. It doesn't attack your values. It recruits them. Your empathy becomes leverage. Your fairness becomes a constraint. Your instinct to keep the peace becomes a mechanism, and the system stays clean. No villains. No enforcers, just norms. Norms that reward predictability and punish deviation. The danger isn't that people are being forced to conform. It's that they're being trained to want to. The final warning is quiet for a reason. The most effective control doesn't feel like control at all. It feels like inclusion. It feels like doing the right thing. It feels like choosing harmony, and by the time you notice the cost, the habit is already formed. You don't feel restrained. You feel responsible. And that is how power lasts. Truth is often described as a virtue, something clean, noble, self-evident. But in environments governed by approval, truth is not a moral achievement. It is a social risk. Not because truth is false, because it is disruptive. Groups are held together by shared narratives, stories about who is good, who is right, who belongs, and why things are the way they are. These stories reduce uncertainty. They allow coordination without constant renegotiation. They keep the system stable. Truth interferes with that stability. An uncomfortable fact does not simply add information. It destabilizes meaning. It forces reconsideration. It introduces doubt into structures that depend on certainty. When someone names a truth that cuts against the group's story, they are not heard as helpful. They are heard as dangerous. That is why truth-tellers are rarely attacked on accuracy. They are attacked on character. Insensitive, divisive, obsessive, motivated by ego. Once the speaker is framed as flawed, the truth itself no longer needs to be addressed. This pattern is ancient. Across history, societies have punished people for disrupting consensus long before consensus was proven wrong, not because the truth was unclear, but because it arrived before the group was ready to absorb the cost of change. Truth creates friction. Power avoids friction. Power depends on predictability. It needs people to act in legible, repeatable ways, to stay inside scripts, to preserve roles, hierarchies, and incentives. Truth, especially inconvenient truth, introduces uncertainty. It forces re-evaluation. So power treats truth as a threat. This is why honesty often carries a price, though rarely a dramatic one. The cost is quiet. A shift in tone, a loss of trust, fewer invitations, subtle distancing, nothing you can point to, just the sense that something has moved. People learn this early. They notice which observations are welcomed and which are met with silence, which questions earn praise and which create discomfort, which truths bring warmth and which bring tension, and they adapt. Not because they stop valuing honesty, but because they value belonging more. Most silence is not cowardice. It is calculation. Say this and risk exclusion. Stay quiet and remain safe. Over time, that calculation begins to feel like wisdom, like maturity, like understanding how the world works. This is how truth becomes expensive. Not everyone can afford it. Some people have too much to lose: reputation, position, access, stability. For them, honesty is not a principle. It is a gamble. So they learn to speak without disrupting, to hint instead of name, to hedge, to soften, to gesture toward reality without fully touching it. The result is a culture saturated with partial truths and careful omissions. Everyone senses the gap. Few are willing to close it. This is the deeper tragedy. Truth and power are often imagined as allies, as if exposing reality naturally leads to justice. In practice, they are frequently adversaries. Truth destabilizes. Power consolidates. Power wants the future to resemble the past closely enough to remain manageable. Truth makes no such promise. This is why institutions resist whistleblowers even when they are correct. Why groups exile members who ask the wrong questions. Why honesty is praised abstractly but punished concretely. Groups say they value truth. They reward those who protect the story. And this leaves individuals with a quiet dilemma. You can tell the truth and risk exclusion, or you can remain included and live with what you did not say. Most people oscillate. They speak when the cost is low. They fall silent when the cost rises. This is not hypocrisy. It is survival logic. But survival logic compounds. Every unspoken truth reinforces the system that made silence necessary. Every avoided discomfort narrows the range of acceptable reality. Eventually, even thinking certain thoughts begins to feel dangerous. So the question is not whether truth matters. It is how much truth you are willing to lose before what remains no longer feels like you. And if the price keeps rising, who decides what becomes unspeakable next? One of the most effective disguises approval ever learned to wear is virtue. People like to believe they adopt moral positions because they are true, because they are right, because they reflect careful reasoning and ethical clarity. But in approval-driven environments, morality often serves a different function. It signals belonging. Moral language becomes social armor. When you use the right terms, express the right outrage, condemn the right targets, you are marked as safe, aligned, on the correct side of the line. The feeling that follows is powerful. Relief, validation, a sense of elevation above something messy and wrong. This is the seduction. Outrage, in particular, is rewarded, not because it resolves harm, but because it demonstrates loyalty. It proves you recognize the approved villains and the approved victims. It shows you understand the emotional script. The more intensely you perform this recognition, the more moral capital you accumulate. And moral capital buys protection. Those who have enough of it can say things others cannot. They can be careless and be forgiven, aggressive and be praised. Their alignment shields them from scrutiny. Those without it must be cautious. They hedge. They qualify. They soften. One misstep and they are exposed. This is how morality becomes currency rather than compass. Public shaming rituals emerge naturally in this environment. They serve a function. They reinforce boundaries. They remind everyone where the line is. Watching someone else be condemned is instructional. It teaches you what not to say, what not to question, what not to think aloud. Participation is often defensive rather than cruel. If you condemn loudly enough, no one will question your position. If you join the chorus, you cannot be mistaken for the target. So people pile on, not because they've examined the situation, but because silence feels dangerous. Moral consensus forms quickly under these conditions. And once it forms, it becomes self-reinforcing. Dissent is no longer disagreement. It becomes immorality. To question the frame is to place yourself outside it. This is where independent thought becomes risky. Groups reward emotional conformity far more reliably than intellectual honesty. Agreement feels stabilizing. It reduces anxiety. Questioning disrupts cohesion, so shared emotion is mistaken for shared ethics. The unsettling part is how good this feels. Moral alignment offers elevation. You're not just correct, you're righteous. That feeling is intoxicating. It quiets doubt. It replaces curiosity with certainty, and certainty is comfortable. But moral consensus is not moral truth. It's a snapshot of what a group currently rewards. History is full of moments where consensus was confident and wrong. From the inside, it never feels that way. From the inside, it feels obvious. This is why the invitation here is uncomfortable. It doesn't ask you to question society alone. It asks you to question yourself. When you express a belief, are you seeking accuracy or approval? When you feel outrage, are you responding to harm or to cues? When you condemn, are you acting from principle or from fear of being mistaken for the wrong kind of person? These questions destabilize identity. No one wants to believe their morality is performative, but the desire to be seen as good is powerful, sometimes more powerful than the desire to be right. And this leads to the dangerous insight. The hunger for moral superiority can corrupt more thoroughly than the hunger for power. Power at least admits ambition. Moral superiority hides behind goodness. It doesn't ask what is true. It asks who is safe to stand with. And in doing so, it can justify cruelty while calling it virtue. That's why the most dangerous people in approval-driven systems are not those who seek control openly. They are those who believe without question that they are already on the right side. If approval is a lever, then inner power begins by loosening its grip. Not by rejecting people, not by posturing or rebellion, but by building the capacity to stand without immediate reassurance. This is harder than it sounds. Most people are not afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of being alone with their thoughts, afraid of holding a position without seeing it reflected back at them, afraid of moving forward without knowing how it will be received. Inner power begins there. It is quiet. It does not announce independence. It develops through repeated exposure to discomfort, through moments of being misunderstood and not rushing to correct it, of being judged and not scrambling to explain. This is emotional insulation, not numbness, not indifference, but the ability to feel social pressure without obeying it automatically. Loneliness often becomes the training ground for this capacity. Not isolation imposed by others, but distance chosen deliberately. Stepping away from constant feedback, from environments where identity is reinforced minute by minute. In that space, something unfamiliar happens. Thoughts slow down. They lose their performative edge. You stop shaping them for reception. A different question replaces the old one. Do I actually believe this? Self-trust forms when belief and action align without witnesses. When you choose the same way in private as you do in public, when your values hold without applause, that alignment is the foundation of power. Not power over others, power over yourself. This stage is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for withdrawal, for disengagement, for apathy, but it is closer to restraint, to patience, to conservation of energy. Those who are always speaking are often still negotiating. Those who are always explaining are still asking permission. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of independence. Not all silence, but the silence that comes from not needing to prove coherence, from trusting that understanding does not have to be immediate. This is why real power compounds slowly. It does not spike. It does not go viral. It grows through consistency, through decisions made in alignment with internal standards rather than external reward. People who develop this capacity are rarely rewarded early. They are not praised for potential. They are often overlooked entirely. That is part of the process. Without applause, thinking sharpens for accuracy rather than impact. You learn to tolerate ambiguity, to live without guarantees, to move based on conviction rather than encouragement. It is not glamorous. It is not motivating in the usual sense. There are no promises, only coherence. And then something shifts. Because you are no longer reacting to approval, your behavior becomes less predictable. You stop optimizing for safety. You make decisions others hesitate to make, not because you are braver, but because you are less dependent. That independence creates gravity. Not everyone will like you. That was never the point. Some will misunderstand you permanently. Others will project motives that have nothing to do with you. You let that happen. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Inner power is the ability to tolerate misinterpretation without internal collapse, to let reputation fluctuate while identity remains stable. This does not mean rejecting feedback. It means feedback no longer governs you. Approval, when it comes, is received with appreciation, not relief. Disapproval, when it arrives, is examined, not obeyed. That is the difference. You are no longer governed by reaction. You are governed by alignment. And alignment carries a quiet confidence. It does not rush. It does not chase. It does not need to be seen immediately. It waits, because anything built on applause can be dismantled by silence, and anything built on coherence endures. Approval is not the enemy. It can be enjoyed, shared, even useful, but it is never the foundation. Inner power begins the moment. You no longer need the room to agree with you in order to stand. From there, everything changes. At the beginning, a question was left unresolved, not because it lacked an answer, but because the answer could not be given yet. Who are you when no one is watching? Not when you're praised, not when you're affirmed, but when approval is absent, when there is no feedback loop to lean on, no audience to confirm that you are safe, correct, or understood. That question is unsettling because it removes the buffer. It asks you to locate yourself without social coordinates. Everything in this documentary circles back to that moment. Approval was never the enemy. It was the mechanism, a biological instinct that once protected us, then quietly became leverage. Systems learn to shape behavior by rewarding alignment and punishing friction. Morality learned to wear consensus. Truth learned to carry a cost. And power learned to stay upstream from applause. So the choice is not dramatic. It is quiet, comfort or clarity, belonging or independence, applause or agency. Most people do not choose once. They choose repeatedly, in small moments, in conversations where silence feels safer, in decisions where fitting in feels wiser, in beliefs where alignment feels better than uncertainty. These choices rarely feel like surrender. They feel like maturity, like compromise, like being reasonable. And over time, they accumulate. What emerges is a life that functions socially but is constantly negotiated internally. A self that is always partially edited, always aware of how it appears. Power, as explored here, is not dominance. It is not control over others. It is freedom from emotional coercion, the ability to act without needing approval to steady you. That freedom is expensive. It costs ease. It costs warmth. It costs being immediately understood. It may cost opportunities that only open to those who fit cleanly into expectation, but it buys something else: integrity. Alignment between what you see, what you believe, and what you do, even when it isolates, even when it goes unrewarded, even when it remains unseen. This is not instruction.